In late May of 1921, white groups attacked and destroyed Tulsa, Oklahoma's prosperous African-American neighborhood known as Greenwood, or Black Wall Street.
Greenwood was gone.
Historian Scott Ellsworth has been studying the massacre for more than 4 decades.
In the course of less than 24 hours, more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses were looted and burned to the ground by a white mob, numbering in the thousands, who were assisted at times by the Tulsa Police Force and the National Guard. You had 35 grocery stores burned down, 35 restaurants burned down, the offices of 12 surgeons and doctors, of dentist offices, a library branch, a U.S. Office Postal substation, a hospital were burned. More than 35 blocks were destroyed. An entire prosperous African-American community in Tulsa, Oklahoma was destroyed. 10,000 people were made homeless overnight. Extremely dangerous time for African-Americans in the United States in the years following World War I. This was the time of the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan, which was an organization not just in the South. It ran the state governments in New Jersey, out in Oregon, in Indiana, and Oklahoma. There was very much a very militant white racism that was everywhere. Jim Crow laws were starting to be introduced in the North where they had never been before. So you had this very difficult period that African Americans are trying to live through. And in the years right after World War I, a race riot, everyone agreed it was when a mob of whites would invade black neighborhoods, loot, burn homes, attempt to kill people, normally off of some sort of a spark of an incident that set people off.
The events in Tulsa started on May 30th, 1921, with an altercation between an African-American shoe shiner and a white female elevator operator.
We don't know what really happened. He might have tripped and fallen onto her when he entered the elevator. We don't know. But the next day, the Tulsa Tribune, which was the city's afternoon daily newspaper, instead portrayed this unknown incident as an attempt, interracial rape attempt by this young man, Dick Rowland. It also ran an editorial entitled "To Lynch a Negro Tonight" on the editorial page, essentially calling for a white lynch mob to take Rowland out of the jail at the top floor of the county courthouse and lynch him. Within a couple of hours, you have a lynch mob growing outside the courthouse, first 100, 200, 500, perhaps 1,000 people ultimately.
A group of African-American military veterans also gathered at the courthouse to protect Dick Rowland. At some point, shots were fired and the powder keg combusted.
The riot really took place in 2 different phases. As soon as the shooting began at the courthouse, the white lynch mob, they didn't care any longer about Dick Rowland. They were now out to get any African American they could. Innocent black men and women who were working downtown were murdered by mob members. The Tulsa police force, meanwhile, showed up, broke into pawn shops, and started out handing rifles and pistols and shotguns to members of the mob who were not armed. African Americans, the men at the courthouse, meanwhile, fought their way back to Greenwood. And during the night, there were attempts by whites to invade Greenwood. So there were whites who would jump into cars and make drive-by shootings down black neighborhoods, firing into homes and whatnot. Shortly before dawn, there was a crowd of whites. We really don't know how many. Certainly 2,000, maybe as many as 5,000 white men, women, even children, armed, were prepared to invade Greenwood. A siren went off, and this mass invasion happened. Any African Americans who fought back were murdered. Others fled the city as quickly as possible. And sort of systematically, building by building, house by house, the white mob would loot and then set things on fire. And by the end of the day, Greenwood was gone, whereas the black population was now being arrested and held under armed guard in internment camps throughout the city.
The city was forever changed.
The riot was national news. In fact, it was international news. It was on the front page of the New York Times, the front page of the Times of London. And what happened is that the white city fathers and businessmen and government leaders realized that they had a public relations problem, that Tulsa was being portrayed as this lawless city where train travel was interrupted and whatnot. And so a conscious decision was made that we're going to sweep this under the rug, and that's exactly what they did. Both of Tulsa's daily newspapers for decades refused to mention the riot, going to extreme lengths where they didn't talk about it. It was really suppressed for a long time. To this day, we just don't know how many people died. We've identified 4 different areas in Tulsa where we believe riot victims are buried in unmarked graves.
Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield is a forensic anthropologist whose parents grew up in Tulsa.
I'm there to finally shed some light on the identity of these individuals who were just anonymously buried. There's still individuals who think that it was a riot on the order of local people destroying their own property and killing their own neighbors, and that's not what happened there. I really think it was an all too typical moment of race relations for the United States, an all too typical occurrence of any successful Black population failing to protect its resources from the majority population. I mean, it happened then, it kind of still happens. It's still that same pattern. Oh, I see prosperity, let me sabotage it.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice.
This is an event of national importance. I think the more we face it, the more we talk about it, the more we look at its significance, and the more we wrestle with difficult issues, not just about what do you do with the remains of riot survivors, but are reparations due to descendants of riot survivors? What do we do with that? I think that this is a hugely important part of our history and one that needs to be taught in the history books as well.